Hello, it's time for taxes, everybody's favorite. Today we will talk about taxes, why we have them, who pays for them, and we will look at tax theory so we can use our supply and demand analysis to better understand how taxes work, also to see how they affect efficiency, and to understand how to basically, when you have to have taxes, have the least inefficient taxes. And then we'll investigate issues of taxation in the United States and around the world and how taxes are implemented and why. So, taxes earn a lot of frustration, right? People complain about their taxes all the time. So why do we have them? Well, to pay for the military, infrastructure, care for the elderly and disabled, public parks, space exploration, education, research, environmental protection, etc., etc. Why? Well, there's a certain class of goods called public goods that markets don't do a particularly efficient job at allocating. If you just give yourself a thought experiment and say, what if no government existed? Think of the Dark Ages or particularly unfortunate countries where no central government exists. What kind of roads exist? What kind of military exists? Right? You don't have a centralized, efficient military. You have, some warlords. And many of us would be working for them for sustenance. Right? So we'll do a much deeper dive on public goods in 2 chapters and look at why we have to have a government provide certain types of goods. But when we look at taxes, the point of a tax is that we can raise revenue that is used to fund things like care for the elderly and paying for the military and the interstate highway system and so on. It doesn't mean you don't have to complain about it though, but that's why we have them. So let's look at an excise tax. We are going to use something called an excise tax so that we can use our supply and demand competitive market framework to make all the theoretical points we need to make about taxes in the simplest way possible. We're going to look at a tax being paid by firms and a tax being paid by consumers, and we will be able to basically fully understand the implications of the tax for both those participants in the market, and we'll be able to look at who is actually bearing the burden of the tax, who is paying for the tax truly, regardless of who writes the check to the government. We'll look at what this does in terms of the revenue we raise to pay for public goods and to the inefficiency we cause when we implement a tax, right? Nothing is free, so if we're going to raise money, we're going to face a trade-off in terms of inefficiency. So what we'll look at is how to minimize that inefficiency in the event that we do have to have a tax. So to define what an excise tax is, it's simply a per unit tax. It's a tax charged on each unit of a good or service that is transacted. Now, this is not the most common tax in the United States, but I do think it's the easiest to show theoretically at the principles level, so it's just going to allow us to clearly make our points that we want to make about efficiency, about equity, and what we will define as tax incidence. That is, who's actually paying the tax. Now, there are some excise taxes around that we're all probably pretty familiar with. Sin taxes, right? Paying a per unit tax when you buy a pack of cigarettes or a giant plastic jug of alcohol, or a glass, much more refined, tasty, smaller jug of alcohol, as well as when you buy a gallon of gasoline. There is a per unit tax each time you do that. So let's get right into our theoretical analysis of the excise tax. Let's see here. The excise, sounds like a horror movie. The excise tax is better. We are going to now examine an excise tax from 2 perspectives. We are going to have there be a tax on firms, where companies pay a tax to the government, and then a tax on consumers, where the consumer basically pays the tax to the government when they buy a good. So let's say we live in a small town where dancing is obviously forbidden and taboo. But all us crazy kids, that doesn't stop us. So we buy Kesha records and we party hard. So let the government of our town place an excise tax on Kesha records, because obviously we're all getting together and partying too hard and knocking down fences when we listen to Kesha records. I still prefer her name with the $ sign, so let's have that be the case. We're going to start with a tax paid by firms. We are going to have a equilibrium and a competitive market for Kesha records. I almost made that with a straight face. And then we're going to have a tax placed on firms that's $4 per record. So we're going to look at what happens to the supply curve. Maybe you remember from studying supply and demand what this is going to do. I hope so. Learned you proper, maybe. Then we're going to look at who actually pays the tax and who pays what of the tax. And then we're going to look at the tax revenue that the government collects to repair all the property damage, and the trade-off and inefficiency, that is the deadweight loss we create by implementing this tax in a competitive market. All right. Let's get to it. So let's start with a Kesha excise tax paid by firms. Paid by firms. Awesome. Let's put price on our y-axis and quantity, of course, on our x-axis. And then let's model supply and demand. Let's have our downward sloping demand curve. This way. And our upward sloping supply curve. And let's have our market be initially in equilibrium. So let's have it that we know our price and quantity, P star and Q star, and let's have our price be something simple, like $10 a record and 100 records transacted. This is efficient. We've got our consumer surplus, our producer surplus, maximized, so our total surplus is as big as possible, and we've got no deadweight loss. Okay? Now, what if that city council comes in and says, we need to tax this. We need to discourage this behavior. So we're going to have a $4 tax per record. And the record stores, the firms, they're the ones who have to pay the $4 tax per unit. Well, let's look at this and consider what's happening. At an intersection of $10 and 100 units, the firm's willingness to accept is that $10, right? In order to be selling 100 units, firms need $10. So what if now they have to account for paying a $4 tax on each one of those 100 records they sell? Now what would their willingness to accept be, right? Now they need that $10 plus the $4 of the tax. Now their willingness to accept has to be, right, basically $4 higher. Right, it would be this $14 here. The problem with that is that that point's floating in time and space. At $14, consumers are not willing and able to buy 100 units. They're willing and able to buy many fewer units. what's going on here? What's happening when we have a tax? What is it doing to the supply curve? If you recall from when we learned supply and demand, one of our supply shifters is a tax. And when taxes go up, and when they're implemented on a firm, supply goes down, right? We have at any price a quantity supplied being less. So what we really have going on here is the supply curve as prime. Right? Yes, the supply curve is shifting down and into the left. But we can measure at any quantity the difference between these two supply curves is the $4 tax. It is the $4 tax. Okay? So what do we have happening here? We've got a quantity supplied exceeding a quantity demanded. Right? That's a surplus. And what happens to a surplus? Well, the prices will have to be bid down, and we end up at some intersection. I'll just call it A for now. What is this? Any guesses? Any guesses at all? Sounds just like class. Hey-oh. All right. What do we have here? We have an intersection between supply and demand in which the amount of the good is being pushed down. Let's say it's at 80 here. I'm just making up pedagogically fun numbers for me. What do we have happening? We have a new intersection, let's say at $12. This is the price for which the record is sold. Right, so this is, I'll call that like P tax. It's also P demand. It's the price that the consumer is actually going to pay. It's the price that you actually see. When I say P tax, I mean this is what you see on the price tag. And it's what the consumer actually pays. They're paying $12. So even though the consumer is not paying this tax, the price has gone up on them. They're paying something. Now, what does the firm get to keep, right? This is incorporating the fact that they have to send $4 per unit to the government. So while they're getting $12 from the consumer now, what they're actually going to keep is 12 minus 4 equals 8. This is, I'll call this P sub S. This is the price that the firms keep. So what has the tax done? It has pushed down the amount that's transacted, and it's pushed the price the consumer pays up, and what the firm gets to keep at the end of the day down. It's driven a wedge between the two. What does this do to efficiency in society? Well, like everything, it has trade-offs. We are generating tax revenue, and it is the rectangular area that is $4, the tax, times 80, the number of units that are transacted. Some of that tax revenue is coming out of what? Some of that tax revenue is coming out of consumer surplus. That means that 12 minus 10, $2 of this tax is paid by consumers each time that this tax is being placed on all these 80 units. So no matter what, even though the firm is paying the check to the government, consumers are paying part of this tax. And some of this tax revenue is from producer surplus. So, yes, firms are writing the check and they pay part of it. But each time that $4 tax is paid, $2 is coming out of producer surplus and $2 is coming out of consumer surplus. Foreshadowing. This is the incidence, the burden. Who actually pays the tax? It's everybody. No matter who writes the check, the consumer and the producer actually end up paying for it as it comes out of their surpluses. So this is tax revenue. This is the benefit of having the tax. The tax revenue is simply length times width. It's the area of this rectangle. And it is 12 minus 8 times what? 80 minus, well, make it really explicit there, 80 minus 0. So we got $4 times 80 bucks. So what are we raising? Calculate. Calculate it. I'll pause it. You calculate it. All right, you got it yet? 4 times 8 is 2 and a 0. 320. All right, so we're going to raise $320 to pay for all the damage we're causing with our Kesha-based hijinks. All right. Now, where there's a benefit, there's a cost. And what is that? We have shaved 20 mutually beneficial transactions out of the market. And when we do that, we generate deadweight loss. We lose some mutually beneficial transactions. So from consumer surplus and producer surplus, we've lost some productive activity from taking place. It's gone now. So how do we get that? Right? It's the area of our triangle, 1/2 base times height. So what have we lost? We've lost 100 minus 80. Times 12. 12 minus 8. The tax. So what will that be? Got 1/2 times 20 times 4. So what do we have? 1/2 times 20 is 10. 10 times 4 is $40. So what we do, in order to gain $320 of revenue, we've lost $40 in mutually beneficial net benefit from participants participating in the market. Okay? So now let's have a tax be paid by consumers. So we're going to start again at equilibrium in the supply and demand framework. Now we'll have a $4 tax paid by consumers. So what's going to happen to the demand curve? Hopefully you recall that that's going to shift demand down and to the left. We're going to look at who pays for the tax and who pays what again, and what the government does as far as collecting revenue to repair all of our property damage. So let's do it. So now we have our Kesha excise tax, and it will be paid by consumers. Okay? So let's put our equilibrium in our competitive market back in place. nice and visible on the screen. And let's be in equilibrium again. Where our market price is 10 and our equilibrium is 100. Okay? Any questions? Wait, you're not actually able to communicate with me. So, force of habit. Force of habit. It's a weird time for everybody, isn't it? Okay. We've got a competitive market here. Now let's say that there is a $4 tax paid by consumers. When we're in equilibrium here, consumers, in order to buy 100 units, have a willingness to pay of $10. Now, what if they have to pay a $4 tax when they buy a record? What will their willingness to pay be then? Will it still be $10? No, if you've got $10, if that's your willingness to pay, and $4 of that has to be taxed, how much of it can actually go to the record? Only $6, right? So what that means is, at this equilibrium, this marginal consumer, in order to buy the good, right, they're going to have a $4 gap down here, which implies that they would only spend $6. Label more. $6 to buy the good because they've got to pay $4 of it in terms of tax. Well, what's the problem here? If I'll only pay $6 to the firm to get the good, will firms sell 100 units still? No. What do we have? We have a bunch of firms who will say, there's no way I'm taking $6. The coin supply to $6 is much less than 100. So what's really going on here? What we have is a downward shift in the demand curve. That is $4 vertical in terms of if you measured it any quantity, right? Demand is right shifting down and then to the left. But if you look at it here, we've got a $4 gap that is explained by that $4 tax, saying that at this quantity, $4 of that would have to go to the tax. So it's driving down my willingness to pay at any price level. So when we're at this intersection, lack of intersection rather, I've got quantity demanded very high, quantity supplied very low. What is that? Quantity demanded exceeds quantity supplied. This is a shortage. What happens to the shortage? Well, the price gets bid up until we have a new equilibrium. I'll call it a point A here. Some different point in which what? There's a new quantity that buyers and sellers will transact at. I'll call it Q tax, and I'll call it 80. And what do we have here? We have an intersection. Let's say it's at $8. And this is now P tax. This is the price of the good under the tax, but then you got to pay the tax. This is what the firm gets to keep. This is our system when you walk up and you see a price, but you know when you get to the register you're going to have to pay tax and that price will be actually higher. So this is what you see as the price of the tax and what the firm keeps, but then the consumer has to pay $4 anytime they buy one of these records. So what do we have here? We have that vertical distance, like I said, of $4 up to the demand curve here. 8 plus 4 is 12. This is what the demanders actually pay once they pay the tax. So this is what you see, when you're picking up the good, and then when you get to the register, now you're paying $4 on top of that so that you can fix the picket fences you've knocked down from raging so hard due to Kesha. Okay. Now what does this do? What does this do? Well, the good thing, again, is that we generate some tax revenue. Where we had consumer surplus, things are going to change a little bit. We are going to now pull some of our consumer surplus and it'll become tax revenue. Right? The consumer is paying that $4 tax physically, and some of that comes out of consumer surplus. But as you can see, the firm is forced to take a lesser price than what they did in the competitive outcome. And so some of the tax revenue comes from producer surplus. So what we get here is, even though the firm doesn't pay the tax, they do really pay the tax, right? They're not actually sending money to the government, but because the tax exists, they have to take a lesser price as they transact less in the market. And so some of that revenue that's generated comes out of producer surplus. What's our tax revenue going to be? It's, what is it? 12 minus 8 is $4 times paying a tax on 80 units. I'll let you calculate this one again. Pause it. No? You got it. It's $320 again. What does that mean? It means it doesn't matter who's paying the tax. We're going to generate this amount of tax revenue. What about the deadweight loss? What's it going to be? All right, we're losing transactions between consumers and producers 20 times. One side of that is the $4 tax. So once again, the deadweight loss is $40. And sorry to tease your arithmetic skills, everybody. The good thing is now, no in-class exams, so yeah, calculators, whatever, it's cool. All right. Any questions? If you do, email me. Sorry. Just entertaining myself here. So in our example, the result's the same. Regardless of who actually pays the government, each agent pays $2 of the tax. This is what we call tax incidence. That's who bears the burden of the tax. Who really pays for it. Okay? In this case, it's a simple example, and I've made, the elasticity of supply and demand equal, so it's a simple starting point. But tax incidence does not have to be split equally. In fact, relative tax incidence, who bears the heavier burden of a tax, depends on who has a relatively higher elasticity with respect to price elasticity of demand and price elasticity of supply. So I'm going to get the board ready, and then we'll look at this further. All right, so to look at relative tax incidence and who bears the burden of a tax based on elasticity, let's look at when demand is inelastic and supply is very elastic, and let's have a tax be paid by firms to show that regardless, when this is the case, the tax will fall overwhelmingly on consumers. So as an example here, let's go back to Prop 64, which is the legalization of marijuana in Colorado, and is a law and a type of law that is gaining momentum across society. Not for me, but just as a economic analysis, we can talk about what are people who enjoy marijuana, their demand tends to be, what do you think, inelastic or elastic? Well, it tends to be pretty inelastic. People who are into this tend to have a fairly inelastic demand for, how do most old people call it? For smoking grass. Right. Where's my blue? Okay. And those who sell at a legal dispensary tend to have a much more elastic supply. Is they can be much more responsive in terms of price. But people who smoke weed, if you said the price of an eighth is going to go up $5 or whatever, I bet most of those people would not stop smoking weed. So, what does that mean? Why legalize weed? Well, we can tax it. And as someone who doesn't smoke weed, I'm all for something people do in a black market being brought into a regular market so we can tax it and pay for public goods that way. So why is this a fairly decent kind of a tax? Let's say we are in equilibrium. And let's say we've legalized weed and we've got big consumer surplus, producer surplus. These are those weed smokers being really happy that their weed is legal and they've got a lot of consumer surplus there. What happens if we institute a tax? So to make it legal to sell, but you have to pay a per unit tax when you sell at the dispensary. So let's say we put a fairly big tax in play. Let's put in a tax like this big. So this is the size of the excise tax. It is going to cause our supply curve to shift down or in or to the left, right? So call that S prime, our new supply curve. That reflects the firm having to pay this tax anywhere. And what we'll get is at this price, at this initial price, right, we've got a high quantity supplied versus a lower quantity demanded. We've got a surplus that needs to be bid down. And that's our point A. And this will be the price, P tax. And it's the same that the consumers pay. Right? So it's going to be higher than without a tax, but are we going to lose a lot of transactions? We're actually not going to lose very many transactions because when demand is inelastic, right, people need a good or service. People are really into this thing. They say it's not addictive or whatever, but people keep smoking it. So what do we see? We see a little deadweight loss emerge from consumers and producers. But what do firms do? Firms here, they're the ones who are much more elastic. They could run away if they wanted to. So they don't bear much burden of the tax. All right, P supply is not much less than P star. So that's P star and P sub S. That is the firm. Bad star, I could do better. Maybe, I don't know. The price that the firm keeps is not much less than what the equilibrium price is. Why is that? Well, look at the tax revenue. It's one giant rectangle from consumer surplus plus one pretty small rectangle from tax revenue from producer surplus to make one big triangle of a lot of tax revenue being brought in that we can use to pay for roads and schools, while we generate fairly little deadweight loss. We don't lose a lot of transactions because even with the tax in place, these consumers still really want this good or service. Get to conspiracy by Taco Bell, but here we are. And this is why, as an economist, I support the legalization of marijuana because it creates very little inefficiency and creates a lot of tax revenue. But the bigger theoretical point here is that when we have a tax on firms, a whole lot of the tax can actually be paid by the consumer, right? So if demand is very inelastic for one group, they will pay a larger burden of the tax. Right, so price elasticity of supply here, it's high. This is a very elastic supply curve relative to the demand curve. The burden of the tax is going to fall away from them and onto the consumer. Right, when you're elastic, you can substitute, you can run, you're price sensitive. So if this were to fall on firms, they'd run away. It has to fall on the consumer because they're the ones who will say, we'll still buy, please don't go. So, again, it doesn't matter who writes the physical check. It matters about elasticity. And are you seeing why this course has a cumulative final? We're doing elasticity and consumer and producer surplus and supply and demand. Still, this stuff really matters. Super applicable to the world around us. Cool. All right. So, therefore, regardless who actually pays the bill, if price elasticity of demand is higher than the price elasticity of supply, the tax would fall heavily on the producers, the firms. But like we showed here, when the price elasticity of supply is higher than the price elasticity of demand, the tax will fall more heavily on consumers, regardless of who has to write the physical check and pay the tax physically. Elasticity determines on whom the tax more heavily falls. Okay. So, to reiterate, there are costs and benefits to imposing a tax. The benefits are that we gain revenues that are utilized to provide essential services. But there are costs too, right? There's no free lunches. There's an efficiency loss. We will observe deadweight loss when we impose a tax in a competitive market. Let's examine tax revenue and deadweight loss in a general fashion, and then we'll learn how to minimize deadweight loss. That is, I would just like to briefly show the anatomy of a tax, make sure we understand where all the important parts are, so we can look at tax revenue, deadweight loss, consumer produces surplus that remain, make sure we understand where that is, and understand tax incidence. So let's just, as a summary, draw why waste your time? I'll fix this and then we'll start again. Okay, I want to waste your time, so now we're ready to go. We've got our excise tax anatomy, price, quantity, market, and equilibrium with our price P star and Q star. Now let's say we have an excise tax. And kind of the point I've been making here is if it's of a certain amount, $1, $3, whatever, 50 cents, it doesn't matter. on whom it's placed. So let's say this is our tax. We could have a tax on firms. That means they need more money at the equilibrium quantity to accept, or it could be a tax on consumers so that they would need to be paying less on the good itself in order to cover the tax. It doesn't matter because we're either going to shift supply in or demand in. It's going to be by the amount of the tax. And so if it was that much, right, our demand curve would go down, we'd intersect supply here. If it was supply, our supply would go down, we'd intersect here. Either way, we'd be at Q tax. It doesn't matter, right? We could have supply shifting in by that amount or demand shifting in by that amount. They're both going down to the left. So it doesn't matter. Either way, we'll get deadweight loss, right? DWL for the cost of having the tax. Either way. And either way, whether this is the price of the good or this is the price of the good that you see, either way, the consumer, our P sub D, is going to be higher than our equilibrium price. And our P sub S, our firm's price that they accept and get to keep, is going to be less than the equilibrium price. So what do we get? We get tax revenue. Some from consumer surplus, some from producer surplus. So consumer surplus, what happens with the tax? We lose some deadweight loss, we pay some tax revenue to the government, and we're left with a smaller triangle of consumer surplus. And firms, you lose some deadweight loss, you pay some taxes to the government out of your surplus, and you're left with producer surplus. Okay? How would we calculate those? To make sure we know that tax revenue is a rectangle, length times width, of price demand minus price supply. So this is going to be the size of the per unit excise tax, PD minus PS, that is the tax, times Q tax minus 0, I'll put a 0 in here, it is, we're paying the tax of this amount this many times. That's why it's this revenue, that rectangle. And our deadweight loss is a triangle of 1/2 base times height. That is also one side of that triangle is PD minus PS, the tax. But the other side here is Q star minus Q tax. That accounts for how many transactions we've lost due to missed mutually beneficial transactions that result from the imposition of this tax. So, and the tax has a benefit. We raise tax revenue to pay for essential services. We have a cost. We lose some mutually beneficial transactions. So that's a trade-off that has to be made if there's a competitive market with a tax. Now I will say, if you have a monopoly or a market that is not operating efficiently, then a tax can be raised and just come out of producer surplus without creating additional inefficiencies. Certain types of taxes can create more inefficiencies in all kinds of market structures, but they don't always necessarily have to create more. If there's already an efficiency, a government can just transfer producer surplus to the government. So, all right, let's now look at how we minimize deadweight loss. So if a tax has to be put in place, let's check out what we should do in order to have basically the least bad tax. So we're going to look at two situations that I've got started for us here. I'm going to have two identical supply curves. So this is going to be basically one starting scenario with two different demand curves. On the left, we're going to have a much more elastic, flat demand curve. On the right, we're going to have a much more vertical and inelastic demand curve. We're going to see for, again, two identical supply curves, what are the ramifications of these elasticities for the tax revenue we raise and for the deadweight loss that we generate. So, if you remember your elasticity, you might be able to intuit just what's about to happen. So again, identical supply curves, we're going to start from there. So on the left, we're going to have ourselves a very much more elastic demand curve. Let's start in equilibrium. Let's have our quantity be 10 and our price also be 10, just for the sake of keeping it simple. So price is 10. Write that bigger. Price is $10, P star. Quantity is Q star. And we've got ourselves an efficient market, just with a pretty flat demand curve. Now, let's have a similar scenario here with a much more inelastic, relatively speaking at least, demand curve. Whoops. There we go. Let's have a much steeper demand curve. And again, this is going to be the same scenario to start with. It's going to look the same. We'll have a $10 price and a 10 unit quantity. Okay? So what we got going. Now let's say we have an excise tax of $3 to be paid by consumers. Okay, so we're going to have a $3 excise tax to be paid by consumers. So what are we going to need to do? If we've got this consumer here who would pay $10 to buy the 10th unit, that marginal consumer, if they've got to pay a $3 tax, now what they're going to be able to spend on the good is just $7. So what we're going to have basically is a, doesn't matter how much to start with. Let's say it's a $3 reduction in what their willingness to pay would be without the tax. And it means that there would be a $3 reduction in demand everywhere. So that should be, right, a $3 decrease anywhere is a vertical distance between these two demand curves, right? Our demand curve is shifting down and into the left. But when we look at it vertically, you can see the amount of the tax there. What are we going to have happen at that $7? We're going to have a quantity demanded that's much greater than the quantity supplied when we look at our graph. So we've got a shortage, and that price we bid, we had been calling that point A, I'll call it point A again. And we have a Q tax here. In this example, let's say it's going down to 7. We're losing 3 transactions. let you copy that down. What is this? This is, right, let's say it's $8. What is this? This is the price of the tax, is the price to the supplier. So this is the price the firm keeps, PS, and I call P-tax kind of what you'd see when you look at the tag in the store. We're getting $8 as far as what firms, P Supply, get to keep. Okay? So what is the consumer going to do then? Those 7 who still buy are going to have to pay a $3 tax on each unit that they consume. So what do we see? The consumer pays the tax. And what do we have here? We've got P demand is 8 plus 3 is $11. So what's happened here? What's happened to efficiency, and what has happened to our deadweight loss? You know, I'm working in my office here. We're gonna have to do some work as far as the math in random places here. What's my tax revenue? What's my deadweight loss? My tax revenue here is the area of these two rectangles making one bigger rectangle. So what do we have here? We've got 11 minus 8, $3, that's our tax, times 7, that's 7 minus 0, the number of units still being transacted. Can you tell me what 3 times 7 is? Very good. $21. I hope the Dora people don't sue me for putting this on the internet. All right. We're going to generate $21 in tax revenue. Now, what about the deadweight loss? We lose some area of producer surplus here and consumer surplus to missed mutually beneficial transactions. What will our deadweight loss be? It'll be 1/2 times 11 minus 8, the tax of $3, times 10 minus 7, the 3 units that we lose. It's a little trickier. 1/2 times $3 times 3, so we got 9 times 1/2. Dr. Wood believes in you. Very good. $4.50 of missed mutually beneficial total surplus. Social welfare has gone down by $4.50, but the government's raised $21 to pay for, shelter for kittens. If you want to pause now and Google images, cute kittens, I'll allow it. And we're back, and you're disappointed to see me. Okay, what's new? Let's look at the scenario where demand is much more inelastic. Okay? Let's have the same scenario. Let's have a $3 tax be put in play. We're going to have this $3 tax again. That is going to result from when a consumer who would pay $10 now has to pay a $3 tax on top of that. If their willingness to pay is 10, something's got to give. 7 only would be able to be given to the good itself. The problem is if someone's willing to pay 7, firms aren't willing to take it, right? What we're talking about is this wedge between quantity demanded and quantity supplied. And that is, demand is shifting down and in to the left. Oops. I'll call that D prime for our new demand curve. This just looks messy on here, so let me get that out of there. Rewrite it. That we've got a $3 vertical distance here. But what's happening? Here, again, we have a shortage. But when that shortage gets bid away to our little point A here, what has happened to the reduction quantity? Q tax is a much smaller reduction, like 9 here, than what the elastic demand generated here. When demand was elastic on the left, if there's a tax, elasticity means responsive, right? If you're responsive to a change in price, you have to pay more because of a tax, a bunch of consumers run away. But if demand is fairly inelastic, the quantity demanded will not go down nearly as much when the tax is in place. So, what do we have here? We have a price for the good. I'll call it P tax and PS because it's the price you'd see on the floor and what the firm gets to keep. It's $9. Right? That hasn't been driven down as much either. What will the consumer pay? Well, the consumer is 9 plus 3, the size of the tax, $12. So price subscript D for demand is $12. What's happened here? Well, we're generating one big rectangle of tax revenue made from two smaller rectangles. But what is the size of that tax revenue here? It's once again $3 because that's the tax, but now it's 9 instead of 7. Now it's 9 instead of 7. What's 3 times 9? $27. Very good. What's happened to tax revenue? When demand's inelastic, we generate a greater amount of tax revenue. What's the deadweight loss? Well, we've lost, again, 2 triangles, and now you're just going to have to listen as I write deadweight loss in a small letter there. Deadweight loss, deadweight loss. Much smaller triangles. To calculate it, it's 1/2 times, again, the tax of $3, 12 minus 9, times missed mutually beneficial transactions, which this time is just 1. So now it's 1/2 times 3 times 1. What is 1/2 times 3 times 1? 150? Very good. So what's happened to deadweight loss? It's now smaller. It was 450 before, and it's 150 now. So, when you have to have a tax, if you've got to pay for something as a public good, what do you want to do? You want to make sure that the tax falls on behavior that is inelastic. You want to make sure that people don't run away because you'll generate more tax revenue and less deadweight loss. You'll have a less or least inefficient tax that you possibly can. So again, everything's trade-offs, everything's context. What we want to do is be as smart as possible when we have to do something like have a tax. Now look at the ramifications of this to the incidence of the tax, right? This is just a little review from earlier. Here, when demand is relatively more elastic, where does the tax revenue come from? Most of it comes from this larger box of tax revenue from producer surplus. The tax revenue from consumer surplus is much smaller, and that's because of the elasticity. When the tax in play, consumers run away a lot more here. Now, when demand's very inelastic, the tax revenue largely comes from incidents affecting the consumer. With inelasticity, you don't substitute much, so when the tax is in play, consumers don't move much and they're willing to pay the tax. Relatively less comes from producer surplus. So buttons. So deadweight loss is less when consumers don't respond in a drastic fashion to the tax. That is, when demand is inelastic. The same would hold true for a tax when you place it on firms. If you have a given demand curve, deadweight loss will be smaller when firms have inelastic supply, and large when firms have elastic supply. So when we're putting taxes in place, we want to look for where the behavior of the agents is inelastic in order to minimize deadweight loss and maximize the tax revenue. Everything has costs, but you want to make those costs as small as you can. So this is why a government or a regulator puts taxes on things like cigarettes or gasoline. It's almost like we're addicted to those things when we consume them. Right? If there are taxes in place on those, people keep driving, people keep smoking. Why? Right? Well, you need to get to work, you're addicted to cigarettes, but when there's a tax, people don't affect their behavior that much, especially in the short run. People will keep consuming and they'll just, I'll pay the tax. Maybe I'll drive a little less, maybe one less road trip, but still I'm going to drive. Okay, let's continue on by talking about taxation and how these concepts we've been studying apply in the world. So along with just the efficiency of the tax, sometimes society cares about things like fairness, or what we call equity, and that is true with the tax as well. And so when that is in play, we discuss this through the context of the benefits principle and the ability to pay principle. The benefits principle says those who benefit from a tax should be those who most heavily pay for that tax. So if you use it, you buy it. And that philosophy underlies more heavily our taxes on gasoline, national parks, public universities, where for gasoline, when you pay your gas tax, when you buy a gallon of gas, that goes towards funding the Eisenhower interstate highway system. So you want to drive, you pay for that through gasoline. The ability to pay principle says that those who have a greater share or a greater ability of income, greater share of wealth, should pay a relatively higher share of a tax. And that's because rich people have a lower margin utility for an additional dollar than do poor people. So the idea behind this, the idea behind the ability to pay principle, is marginal utility just applied to wealth. All right, so what is our relationship between wealth and utility? Well, as you get more wealth, you get more utility, right? Everybody likes to have more money. But like like pizza, like beer, like everything we've talked about this semester, wealth has diminishing marginal utility. Think of it this way. Let's say you have $0. How happy are you if someone gives you $1,000? Now let's say you have $1 million. How happy are you someone gives you $1,000? Now let's say you have $1 billion. How happy are you that someone gives you $1,000, right? That $1,000 does not give you the same amount of additional happiness or utility regardless of your wealth level, right? If you have no money and someone gives you $1,000, now you can eat. That's really important, right? If you've got $1 billion and someone gives you $1,000, you're like, cool, $1,000, that's great, right? It's not like so important. So what we have is a utility curve for wealth that increases at a decreasing rate, right? As you get more money, yes, your utility continues to go up, but that increase levels out, right? A penny is not always really worth the same thing to you in terms of your happiness. As a grad student, when I had no money, right, a penny was worth a lot more to me than it is now that I am a professor. Very different. So, what does that mean? It means that, a lot of research into happiness or something says, above $75,000, $80,000 a year, that additional wealth doesn't bring you much market utility. There's a lot of diminishing market utility for a dollar after your increase in wealth, past $75,000. Past that point, it's stuff like the quality of your work, your friendships, spiritual life, hobbies, other things other than money give you more utility at the margin once you've basically taken care of all of your needs and have security. So, yeah, that's the argument, at least, behind why we have an ability to pay principal. That is, that those with greater amounts of wealth should pay higher proportions of taxes. So those are kind of two arguments about fairness. Now, taxes impact people of different means in varying degrees. We have different types of taxes that follow the ability to pay principal or don't. Progressive taxes follow the ability to pay principal. With a progressive tax, relatively wealthier people pay a larger proportion of their income than poorer people do for a tax. So the U.S. federal income tax is a progressive tax, where very poor people pay a lower proportion of their income to federal tax. Much richer people pay a larger proportion of their income to the federal income tax. Regressive taxes are when poorer people pay a larger proportion of their income than wealthier people do. Sales taxes are like this, right? So if there are sales taxes on necessities, foods, stuff like this, who pays a larger proportion of their income for needs? It's the poor. They spend almost everything they have on meeting their needs. So they're going to spend a large proportion of their income on the sales tax, whereas rich people, they could pay absolutely more for the sales tax, but it's going to affect them less in terms of utility because they're going to spend a much lower proportion of their income on meeting the sales tax. Now, a flat tax is, to an orthodox economist, a regressive tax in disguise. A flat tax is when people pay the same percentage regardless of income remains. So there's income taxes like in Russia and several other countries of the former Soviet bloc, Mongolia, where everybody pays 12% in federal income tax. It's easy to collect that, but 12% of a poor person's income affects their utility much more than a very wealthy family. And so the people who argue for flat taxes tend to be, Steve Forbes, people who are very wealthy and would like to keep more of their money, which I understand. Who doesn't want to keep their money? But from a social perspective and from a fairness perspective, if you're going to implement taxes under the ability to pay principal, a flat tax is a regressive tax because the same percentage does not mean the same thing to everyone. Again, when I was a graduate student, having to pay 12% versus as a professor having to pay 12%. When I was a poor grad student, that 12% meant a lot more to me than it does when I'm a professor. All right, so here I'm just going to point out that no matter what kind of income you have or whatever you're doing, there will be a tax for it. It doesn't matter. Again, this has been Franklin's certainty, death and taxes, right? Whatever you have, there will be a tax on it. And so that's why it's important to figure out the least inefficient ways to have these taxes. Okay, so this is something that I've found that many of my students don't understand, and that is a marginal tax rate. And this is important because our federal income tax operates this way. Marginal, of course, means, yes, change. The additional, the next, right? A marginal tax is where different dollars get taxed at different rates. So let's say we'll do a hypothetical, and then I'll talk about the real numbers in the coming slides. Let's say for a hypothetical example here, you make $40,000 a year, and you're in the 15% marginal income tax bracket. Now, people hear that, and people don't even do the math and check. They think that they're paying 15% of their income to this tax. But not every dollar gets taxed at 15%. Only the marginal, only the last dollar is being taxed at that percent. So if you're in the 15% marginal income tax bracket, you're actually paying less than that for the tax. So let's say in our hypothetical, up to $30,000 a year, income is taxed at 10%, and after that, it's at 15%. So what that means on January 1st, when you start working, you are going to pay 10 cents to this tax, to this federal tax. You're going to keep 90 cents on every dollar you make. And so that'll be for the first 3/4 of the year. So through the first 9 months of the year, all your dollars will be taxed that way. That next dollar, that $30,001st dollar, will get taxed at 15%. But all those first $30,000, they're done. They get taxed at those first $30,000 get taxed at 10%. It's over. They don't start getting taxed at 15%. It's done. They got taxed at the lower rate. Only marginal dollars after that breaking point, after $30,001, get taxed at 15%. So from that point on, now you're keeping 85 cents and you're sending 15 cents to the government to pay for fighter jets and interstate highways and whatever else. Okay? Now here are the prior numbers to 2016. I will use our current numbers under the tax change under the Trump administration. So here's some brackets. Let's say we're single, most of us are, in our context of our class and so on. So let's say we're filing single. The 10% tax bracket says that from when you start working until you make $9,700, whenever that is, your dollars get taxed at 10%. Then from $9,701 to $39,475, only those next dollars get taxed at 12%. These first $9,700, they stay put at 10%. They won't get taxed more just because you made more. They're done. It's the $9,701 marginal dollar up to $39,475 that get taxed at 12%. Then from $39,476 to $84,200, now we jump to 22%. So what you do is you make more money throughout the year. That next dollar eventually will break into a higher bracket, and only the dollars at the higher bracket get taxed at the new higher rate. So for the very wealthy who say, I get taxed at the 37% rate, that's only once they make $510,000 do they get taxed at the 37% rate. So the janitor and the CEO on January 1st, they're both getting taxed at 10%. It's just that the CEO will graduate very quickly into the 12, 22, 24, 32, 35, 37%, whereas it might take a few months for the janitor to graduate into the 12%. I hope that makes sense, because if you're going to work in this country, you're going to deal with this system. When dealing with the United States, like I said, our most common U.S. taxes at the federal level are this income tax, as well as the payroll and the profit taxes. And at the local and state level, many states, ours in Florida does not, but many of them have an income tax. But they also have sales taxes, profit taxes, property taxes. Even if they don't have an income tax, they will find a way to tax you. It just will look like a little bit of a different tax. So taxes in the U.S. sometimes follow the benefits principle, sometimes they follow the ability to pay principle, and sometimes they don't. So let's look at some fun examples. The benefits principle, like I said, gas taxes pay for interstates, national park admission fees pay for maintaining the parks, and college tuition pays for public universities. So those are things owned by the public, by all of us, and you have to pay in order to use them, basically. However, many states receive more in federal benefits than they pay in taxes. And this is just me enjoying a little bit of irony here. I like it when everyone is silly. So the red states here are states that are receiving more in federal funding than they're paying in taxes. And the green to dark green states are states that are paying more in terms of taxes than they're receiving in services. What I enjoy here is that these states that are more green tend to be more Democrat, left-leaning states who tend to be okay with taxes. And a lot of these red states that are, or orange states that are receiving more in benefits, so Kansas, Oklahoma, are receiving more in benefits than they pay, tend to be more Republican, not for taxes, against taxes, kind of politically places. And so that means everyone's voting against their best interests in this respect. And I love it when everyone's doing something silly. That amuses me. I love irony. Everyone's silly. Okay. Taxes in the United States. Again, we do have taxes that follow the ability to pay principal and some that don't. One that doesn't is actually the Social Security and Medicare tax. It's progressive. It's only paid on up to around $106,000 on income. So the wealthy pay actually a lower proportion of their income on it. That means that I'm paying roughly the same amount into Social Security and Medicare as LeBron James and Jeff Bezos. So that's very regressive. The federal income tax is more progressive. Again, we saw that wealthier people pay a higher proportion. You graduate into higher tax brackets. Once people make $510,000 a year as a single person, their next dollars from $510,000 to a trillion all get taxed at 37%. This is actually much less progressive than it used to be. And so here is a look at the highest income tax bracket, highest top income tax rate in the United States. I enjoy things like this when we look at, again, irony and arguments that people make that data just don't support. This is when being an economist is really fun. We take something people say, and then we look at the data and go, does that hold up or does it not? So the top marginal income tax rate was once as high as 92%. Again, now it's 37%. That does not mean the government took 92% of your money. It means that once you made such a high amount of income, then they started taking 92% of each dollar. So you graduated into higher rates, and eventually it became 92%. Now, some of our strongest growth as a country was when this was happening, right? So let's look at it. We've got in the late 40s, throughout the 50s, and into the 60s, high marginal tax rates. We've got this drop to 70%. This is Nixon era. And then here's the Reaganomics. Here is Ronald Reagan pulling taxes all the way down to 28% on the wealthiest Americans. So this was a drastic reduction in taxes on the wealthy. And this is now that same data, right? Here is our top income tax rate for the richest coming down. And I've got this overlain with unemployment. And so I hear frequently that we have to cut taxes on the rich or keep taxes on the rich down because they will create jobs for people. And so, okay, show me that in the data. Well, I don't see that in the data. Here's the direction of top income tax rates. Here's unemployment. If anything, unemployment is trending up while tax rates go down. But what I see probably is no relationship between the two. And people who have a great deal of money like to have their income taxes be low, right? Wouldn't you? And so they've done a really good job at perpetuating an argument that we can't make jobs unless our taxes are low. But that just doesn't show up in the data. Just the ultra-rich like to keep their money. And again, I'm not blaming them. Who wouldn't? Is that efficient for society? No, but here we are. So, yeah, this is an interesting picture, right? This is the picture of Reaganomics cutting taxes, and this is the picture of George H.W. Bush and other presidents having them higher than that level because 28% was just too low. Big deficits came in place, and George H.W. had to pull those tax rates back up, and so it cost him his job. For many reasons, George H.W. Bush was a national treasure and a hero. So I'm going to have a sip of coffee in a moment of silence for him. War hero, president. So, how do taxes differ by income groups? Well, federal taxes tend to be progressive, while local and state taxes tend to be regressive. If you see here in the blue, these are our federal taxes paid, and it's going to be across income groups in the United States. So this is the poorest 20%, and then the next richest 20%, the next richest 20%, up until here is the top richest 1% of Americans. And you can see that federal taxes are progressive. The very poorest pay only 5% in federal tax, while up to the richest 1%, now we're up to over 21%. Now, red is state and local taxes, and as I said, they do not tend to follow the ability to pay principle. They're regressive. And you can see that with the poorest 20% pay 12% of their income on state and local taxes, while the richest 1% only pay 7.9% in state and local taxes. And that's largely because things like sales taxes are indeed regressive. When you've got a whole lot of money, you're paying a small proportion of your income on your, needs and wants and consumption, whereas poor people pay a much larger proportion of their income on those goods. So, if you stack federal and local and state taxes into one total tax bill, we do have a somewhat progressive system. The poorest 20% pay around 17.4% in taxes, and then it goes 21, 25, 28.3, and then it really kind of flattens out, right? And we've got a tax system that actually, it's progressive at first, but then it becomes actually kind of regressive in that the top 1% pay less taxes than the 80th to 90th percentile in income. So it's actually kind of regressive. It has to do with the type of income they bring in and how good their accountants are. So, is the system progressive? A bit, but not as much as many people think. Now, this is a normative question, and this is not one that I can answer, but this is a question for society in general. Now, if you take 17.4% of $20,260, that is the threshold for being the richest poor family in the bottom 20%. So if you're the richest poor family in the bottom 20%, 17.4% of that is $3,526. That means you are going to spend $3,500 in taxes and leave your family with $16,733. Is that good? Again, this is a normative question. Now, here's the poorest 1% family. So the poorest family in the top 1% is making $1.1 million. 29% of that would be $329,928. That's a chunk of change. I will not deny that. And that would leave that family with $807,000. So is this a good system? Again, that's going to be a normative question and one that is up for a dialogue and a continuing investigation of what's optimal for society going forward. Many people think that this number is too high. Many people think this number is both too high and too low for the richest family. Some people think these numbers are too high for both. If that's the case, the country has to investigate many of its spending and debting options and obligations going forward. So there's a lot of questions here for society and for you as a member of society as we go forward, and how we treat the least of us and those who have the most. Now, how does the United States compare to the rest of the world? We actually collect a fairly small amount of tax revenue compared to other developed countries. So here's the OECD countries, basically the 30 most developed countries in the world. That's kind of how it's thought of. And we look at the proportion of GDP, the amount of stuff we make in general, right? You learn that in macro, or you will learn it in macro. It's essentially the amount of stuff we make total as far as productive activity goes. What percentage of that do we collect as taxes? France leads the way, Denmark 46%. The average is 34% for developed countries, and we are down here at 27%. So we actually collect a lower percentage of what we generate as a country in taxes than the average developed country. So we actually collect less. I know it doesn't feel like that, when you see your taxes going out of your paycheck, but we actually collect less than other developed countries do. When it comes to corporate tax rates, we used to have a fairly high one, and very recently, ours has now been reduced to below the OECD average. We used to have a bit of a higher one, and it is now less. We talked about the highest marginal income tax rate for the wealthiest Americans. So to give some context to this, again, we have 37% as our top highest income tax bracket. If we look at the other countries of the world, some countries go as high as 61% as the highest marginal tax rate for the rich. A lot of developed countries are somewhere in the 45 to 55% range. We're looking at Japan and the Netherlands, Germany, Belgium, Iceland, the UK, France, and Australia, all 45%. And then, if you really hate taxes, Russia, Belarus, Tajikistan, we got some flat taxes, like 12, 13% here. Pretty swell. If you really hate taxes, Somalia. Now, there's no functioning government, but you don't have to pay taxes. So it just depends on how you feel about being a pirate in Somalia. If that sounds great, head on over. Otherwise, you're going to have to pay some taxes. But this is the highest tax rate for the richest people in these countries. And so, when I look at this, I look at countries that are highly developed. They tend to put a higher proportion on the highly wealthy than do, Albania and Yemen. But again, these are sometimes normative questions. But when it comes to actually applying economics to these normative questions and what this does to tangible variables that we can measure, I have to mention the Laffer curve. Let me erase the board. So let's mention the Laffer curve as one application of examining taxes in reality. So the Laffer curve was an idea by Art Laffer, an economist who, whether it's true or not, the rumor is, showed this to the Reagan people on a cocktail napkin as an idea of we can have our cake and eat it too. Because taxes are so high, we can cut tax rates and actually increase tax revenue. The idea was because tax rates are so high, people are disincentivized from working. And so if we cut those tax rates, people will invest, people will work, and they will then create tax revenue from actually doing productive stuff instead of basically hiding because they don't want to pay taxes. So let's look at what the argument is here. So let's say we've got a Laffer curve. Let's say it exists. I'm not really sure that it does exist in this capacity, but I've got tax rate on the X and tax revenues on the Y-axis. And the idea here is that if there is no tax rate whatsoever, no tax revenue can be generated. So as you increase your tax rate, tax revenues will go up. But at some point, as you go from 0 to 100 tax rate, excuse me, tax rates get so high that people go, nah, I don't want to do anything. I don't want to work. So I'm just going to stay home. And what that will do is, as tax rates go up, it'll drag tax revenues back down. So a lot of the Reaganomics idea here was that when tax rates are so high, we can cut taxes. And what we'll actually do, like if tax rates are super high, we'll cut taxes, people will work, and we'll actually bring in a higher level of tax revenue. And I don't mean to just impugn one president or one group of politicians about this. This sort of thinking and this trickle-down economics kind of idea of, let's cut taxes and a lot more good things will happen for everybody magically, has crossed political aisles in the United States for sure. So what happened really? Right, the idea was we can have some tax rate 1. I'll call that tax revenue 1. Point A on this line here. We're going to cut taxes, we're going to raise tax revenue. So let's cut the tax rate drastically to tax rate 2, and let's make more tax revenue happen. Except what happens if taxes are not past this breaking point, if that breaking point even exists. So this is being generous and saying the Laffer curve does exist. If it does exist, what happened was we were not on the right side of this curve. Tax rates were cut, tax revenues went down drastically. The government was also spending a ton of money in an arms race to the Soviets and not being responsible with a reduced tax revenue. And deficits were very, very large. In fact, George H.W. Bush had to come back and raise his taxes on the richest people back a little bit. And when he's somebody who said, read my lips, no new taxes, and he had to raise his taxes for the good of the country, he lost his job. Again, he's somebody I admire because he puts economics and the good of the country ahead of party and self, which seems to be very out of fashion at this point. So the question would then be, what is tax rate optimal, tax rate opt, in order to get tax revenue max? If that was the goal, that is, how can we get the most tax revenue to pay for the military and for our debt and so on, without causing additional reductions in tax revenue, again, if the Laffer curve does exist. Some nonpartisan research says that tax rate would be 63%. Whereas a conservative economist whom I respect, and is pretty universally respected in the field, he was the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors in the George W. Bush White House, says that top marginal tax rate should be around 50%. Both of those are much higher than the Obama White House that had 39.6% and the Trump White House at 37%. So tax rates could be a lot higher on the rich. And there's no guarantee that it is this parabola, this inverse U shape. This curve very well could be some kind of increasing at a decreasing rate kind of function. Okay, taxes are fun. Nobody likes to pay them. We're going to use them to pay for our public goods. Coming up, we're going to talk about externalities as a market failure and those public goods that we use tax revenue to pay for. Have a wonderful, wonderful day. I hope you are staying safe and happy and healthy. Keep calm and study your economics and continue to make your life better in a world of uncertainty. And if you need anything, please let me know. Have a great day.